On the morning of December 6, 1917, the SS Mont-Blanc entered the Narrows approaching Halifax Harbor. The Mont-Blanc was carrying a shipment of explosives destined for France, weighing nearly 3,000 metric tons. It would collide with another ship in the Narrows. In the resulting fire, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions would occur. Almost 2,000 people would die in the explosion, with another 9,000 injured, along with destroying a large section of Halifax. So, what happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we are diving into the Great Halifax Explosion, a needless and terrifying tragedy that claimed many lives and caused so much devastation to the surrounding city. During World War I, both Germany and the British Empire relied heavily on imports for food and raw materials to support the war effort. The British had a large advantage in numbers and could travel the seas freely, while Germany was largely restricted to the North Sea. To counter the British superiority in numbers, the Germans launched a fairly successful U-boat campaign against Britain and their allies' shipping in the seas around Europe. This U-boat campaign from 1914 to 1918 would see the sinking of roughly 5,000 ships, which would equal to over 12 million tons of cargo lost. Later in the war, Allies developed countermeasures to lessen the effectiveness of the U-boats. One of the most successful ones was setting up convoys. Large numbers of merchant vessels would travel in groups, typically protected by Navy warships. Convoy losses to U-boat attacks would be relatively small as the U-boats sought out individual ships or smaller convoys. Another countermeasure used to protect against U-boat attacks was the use of an anti-submarine net to protect harbors, like the one they used at Halifax. This net would be stretched across the entrance to the Narrows near McNab Island every night and be taken down in the morning to allow ships to go in and out. And in World War I, Halifax was booming. It was one of the largest and busiest ports in the world. It was the center of Canada's war effort and also a convenient staging area for ship convoys heading to Europe. The city's population grew rapidly to over 60,000, and this number did not include all the workers, soldiers, and sailors, along with their spouses, that flowed into the city every day. Food, clothing, weapons, and thousands of men came through Halifax every day by train before being loaded onto ships heading to the western front of World War I. With this, the area surrounding Halifax grew rapidly. Farming and manufacturing sectors saw rapid growth. Halifax's income from exports jumped from $19 million in 1916 to $142 million in 1917. So things for the most part were looking up in Halifax. But there was problems on the harbor. With the war going on, the harbor was getting busier. And if you've ever worked any type of production, you probably already know that when shit gets busy, safety often takes a backseat to getting things done now, which can often lead to an increase in accidents or injuries, and depending on what you're doing, this can lead to major consequences, like when the regulations for transporting explosives safely get dropped or ignored. Usually not a good thing when safety concerns about shit that goes boom gets ignored. Before the war started, ships carrying explosives were not allowed in the harbor. They had to stop just outside the harbor near George Island and unload the explosives during daylight hours only onto smaller boats. Then these boats carrying smaller loads of explosives had to fly a red flag to mark it as carrying a dangerous load, and while it was on the move in the harbor, all other traffic had to come to a standstill. But with the threat of a possible U-boat attack, they stopped the red flag requirement since it would make it too obvious a target if a U-boat was in the area, which also meant the requirement for boats to stop while shit was being moved was dropped, since no one knew who was carrying explosives. One regulation that was not dropped but would cause issues was the use of harbor pilots. Any ocean-going ship coming into the harbor had to have a harbor pilot. These pilots knew the section of the Narrows and would guide the ship through it safely. However, they only had 14 of these pilots, and they were making a lot of money and refused to cooperate with any plans to bring in more, since it would mean they would basically get a pay cut. The pilots were also a bit unruly, more often than not sharing information about ships' cargo and movements. To further complicate this, the task of communicating daily ship movements was left in the hands of a 15-year-old clerk. A 15-year-old clerk who was continuously laughed at and mocked every time he tried to call in his reports, which never got written down. So he eventually quit calling in ship movements. So shit in the harbor wasn't exactly great, especially when you add in impatient ship captains, or captains with little experience with the ships they're running, which just happens to be the equivalent of a really big fucking bomb. So let's meet these fine gentlemen and their ships. First up, we have Captain Haakon Fromm. Captain Fromm was the captain of the Imo. The Imo was a 430-foot long, all-purpose steamer, perfect for transatlantic shipping and owned by the Norwegian South Pacific Whaling Company, and was on loan to the Belgian Relief Commission to haul supplies between North America and Europe. Belgium being neutral meant they carried mostly humanitarian supplies. And then we have Captain Amy Lemedic of the Mont-Blanc. The Mont-Blanc was owned by the French line and had guns added front and back for use in the war. Captain Lemedic had not been a captain for very long, and his previous ships had been smaller, and he never captained a ship carrying explosives before, but hey, first time for everything. And for his first trip on the Mont-Blanc, he got sent to New York. And of course, for security reasons, they did not tell him what he was picking up there. When they got to New York, they were sent to Brooklyn and given plans to cover every inch of metal in their holds with wood, cloth, tar, and rubber, and to only use copper nails to secure everything. Then they had to wait 3 weeks while the holds were filled with boxes and barrels. By the time they were done, the ship was loaded with 62 tons of gun cotton, 250 tons of TNT, and 2,366 tons of picric acid, which is a more powerful and unstable form of TNT. At this point, they had the equivalent of 3 kilotons of TNT, so a fifth of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And since this obviously wasn't enough explosives, after all this was built and packed up nice and neat and sealed up, France decided they needed more benzoil, a highly flammable fuel. So they added another 246 tons of this shit to the ship. And unlike the other explosives that were at least stacked and separated and placed carefully, this highly volatile fuel was just thrown wherever they could find room for it. And when I say highly volatile, I mean a little spark could set it off. And it was just being thrown around right over the other high explosives in the hold. And with that, the ship is now carrying 6 million pounds of the most explosive and volatile chemicals known to man at this point in time. With all the weight on the ship, its best speed was estimated to be no more than 8 knots, or 10 miles per hour. Since it would not be able to keep up with any convoys leaving New York, it was sent to Halifax to try to catch a slower moving convoy there. So at 11 p.m. on December 1st, the Mont-Blanc left Gravesend Bay heading to Halifax, carrying the largest load of explosives ever loaded on a ship. It would be a nerve-wracking 4-day voyage, hugging the coast all the way up to Halifax. When they arrived outside of McNab Island on the 5th, they just missed being able to enter safe harbor. The submarine nets had already been closed for the night, so they'd have to spend one more night outside the harbor at anchor. While they just missed getting in, Captain Fromm on the Imo just missed getting out. Being a neutral ship, they were low on Halifax's priority list, so when they had placed an order for coal, the coal company dragged their feet getting to them, and by the time they were loaded, the gate would be closed. They'd have to spend the night in the harbor before being able to get out and continue to New York. At 7:50 the next morning, Captain Lemedic and harbor pilot Francis Mackey got the Mont-Blanc moving into the harbor. They got the ship up to 4 knots going down the Narrows. It'd take them 90 minutes to get all the way through to where they could drop anchor in the harbor, and they were in no hurry. They were now safe from possible U-boat attack, and going faster only increased the risk of setting something off. They took their time going through the Narrows, reducing speed further to avoid smaller boats in the harbor. As the Mont-Blanc entered the harbor proper, the Imo was pulling up anchor and getting underway. And since communications in the harbor were a clusterfuck, and very few knew what ships were coming or going, no one knew the Imo was scheduled to leave, and the Imo knew nothing about the Mont-Blanc. At this point, there was roughly 4 people not on the Mont-Blanc that knew what they were carrying, and since they were not flying the munition flag, no one in the harbor had any way to know the ship was dangerous. Captain Fromm, being impatient and in a hurry, ignored established protocol as they approached the Narrows. He had the ship moving faster than any other ship in the harbor and was heading more towards the left channel in the Narrows than the right, where they should have been. Typically, when ships are moving through areas, they have channels they should stick to, like driving down the highway. You should be in the right-hand lane or channel if you're on a boat. Oncoming traffic should be to your left. Captain Fromm signaled to an oncoming ship, the SS Clara. They were going to go to the right where they should be, but the Clara responded they intended to stay on course, meaning once Captain Fromm agreed to this, both ships would be in the wrong channel. So once the Imo passed the Clara and entered the Narrows, they were in the left channel, the same channel the Mont-Blanc was using. To make matters worse, the Imo was still going faster than they should have been in the Narrows and had to head further left to avoid a tugboat with a load of scows being towed behind it. The Mont-Blanc was still proceeding slowly down the Narrows. They moved further to the right to avoid a ship. They came to within 100 feet of the shore as they continued on. About this time, they saw the Imo a mile away, flying down the Narrows straight at them. There was a bit of fear on the Mont-Blanc bridge that the crew of the Imo might not be able to see them, given the angle of the sun behind them and how low they were sitting in the water. They didn't need to worry, the Imo had seen them coming. The Mont-Blanc signaled they were staying where they were. They were in the correct lane and not moving. The impatient Captain Fromm on the Imo signaled they weren't moving and intended in passing them on the left. Signals flew back and forth on who was doing what. The Mont-Blanc eventually responded by moving closer to shore. They were now dangerously close to shore and potentially running aground. Captain Fromm changed directions to his left. A deadly game of chicken was afoot in the Narrows. With the distance between the two ships dwindling down to nothing, Captain Lemedic made the last-second desperate decision to cut to the left towards the center channel. They hoped to narrowly escape a collision. It was the wrong choice. Captain Fromm, at the last second, threw his ship from full speed ahead to full speed astern, which swung the rear of the ship towards the shore and the front of the ship towards the right, pointing towards where they should have been all along. Collision was now imminent. Captain Lemedic did the only option left to him. He ordered his ship to full speed astern. He hoped by throwing the ship into reverse, he could slow the ship enough to lessen the impact of the collision and the chance of setting off the floating bomb his ship had become. The ships were slowed, but the Imo's bow still swung towards the Mont-Blanc. At 8:46, the game of chicken came to an end as the Imo struck the side of the Mont-Blanc. The Mont-Blanc did not immediately explode like some of the crew expected. However, the Imo ripped open a V-shaped hole in the side from the waterline up to the deck, 6 feet wide. The hole was right over the number 1 hold, containing the benzol fuel and picric acid. The crash knocked barrels of benzol over. Many of the barrels broke as they smashed against the deck, sending the highly volatile fuel all over and dripping down into the holds below. The 2 metal ships were now entangled with each other, and Captain Fromm continued to pull his ship back at full speed. As the Imo pulled itself free, metal rubbed against metal, sending sparks into the fuel that was now spreading across the deck. The fuel ignited with the first contact. Fire spread quickly, sending thick smoke into the sky. Flames would shoot higher into the sky every time it hit another barrel. The Mont-Blanc crew were on edge, waiting for the ship to explode any second, but their discipline did not allow them to panic. They made their way towards the bridge for orders from Lemedic, strapping down loose barrels on their way. They had no way to put out the fire, and sinking the ship would have taken way too long. So, with no other options, Lemedic ordered the ship to be abandoned. Lifeboats were dropped into the water as the crew desperately escaped the ship. In their haste to escape, no one yelled out warnings to the Imo or other nearby ships as far as what was on the Mont-Blanc. Most in the area assumed she carried oil or gas based on the fire on deck. Without the munitions flag to warn them, they had no idea of its true cargo. So the Imo did not rush to get away, and other ships and lifeboats came closer to the Mont-Blanc to help rescue its crew. Captain Lemedic and harbor pilot Francis Mackey were the last to leave the ship. Captain Lemedic had to damn near be dragged off the ship by the crew, who argued with him to abandon ship and lead them to safety instead of going down with the ship. Mackey had decided to save himself instead of staying behind, thinking nothing he could do would change what was about to happen, so his sacrifice would be in vain. With the ship drifting towards the Richmond area, which put them much closer to the Halifax shoreline, they chose to make for the Dartmouth side of the Narrows, 800 feet away. They rowed as hard as they could, but the heavy lifeboats did not go very fast. An explosion on the deck of the Mont-Blanc would urge them to go faster. Once on the shore, they jumped from the lifeboats, leaving them unsecured on the shore as they dashed into the woods ahead of them. They were met by a woman named Aggie March and her baby girl, who they tried to warn of the danger, but she did not speak French, so she had no idea what they were saying. A sailor, frustrated by this, grabbed Aggie's baby and ran into the woods, which led Aggie to chasing after him, just like he hoped. Once far enough in, he gave up the chase and tossed Aggie to the ground and covered her and her daughter with his body and waited. He undoubtedly saved their lives that day. With the crew now hiding in the woods and wondering why their ship had not exploded yet, people had gathered to watch the show on the water. With no one on board, the Mont-Blanc was at the whims of the current as it drifted to the Richmond shore. People watched and tried to guess where it would stop. And for the most part, people would watch unconcerned. Workers nearby would watch for a few, then go back to work. The Mont-Blanc would eventually wash up next to a pier and run aground. The smoke from the burning deck would draw bigger and bigger crowds, all amused at the curiosity of the crew running away to the opposite shore. Deck fires were fairly common in the harbor, and no one saw the danger coming. Other nearby ships helped to get the Mont-Blanc secured to Pier 6 and tried to put out the fire to no effect. The fire was getting out of hand and starting to spread to the wharf. If they didn't do something, the fire threatened the whole town. So, they decided to tow the ship away. While they did this, the Mont-Blanc put on a fireworks display for the growing crowds. At least 7 barrels of fuel exploded and were launched, streaking flames into the sky. It had now been 14 minutes since the collision with the Imo, and word of the accident was spreading, with more and more people stopping to go down to the Narrows to watch or to stare out their windows at the drama unfolding on the waterfront. The drama happened at the right time of the morning as people were preparing to start their day. Instead of going to work or school, they watched the harbor, and the fire was just getting bigger and hotter. When the local fire department got there with their shiny new mechanical fire truck, they could barely look directly at the fire, and the roar coming from it drowned out all sound. They had to yell at the person next to them to be heard. Then, with no explanation, it was silent. The ship still poured smoke into the air, barrels exploded, and were sent into the sky, but no noise was heard. A deathly quiet settled over the area. At 9:04, with dozens of people scrambling over the ship to put out the fire, the heat and the fire hit the hold and the ship exploded. The explosion lasted 1/15th of a second. It shot up temperatures on the ship to 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The blast traveled at 4 times the speed of sound and tore through the ship like it wasn't even there. It turned the ship into nothing but shrapnel, sending jagged pieces of metal flying through the air. Metal was sent through nearby ships and shops. People were killed or injured hundreds of yards away. The largest recognizable pieces were a half-ton anchor found 4 miles away and a deck cannon 3 miles away. The water around the ship, along with anyone that happened to be close by the ship, were vaporized. They were just gone, with no traces left behind. A mushroom cloud 2 miles high rose above the explosion. The black cloud rained down burning tar and shrapnel on anyone still standing that was too close. A shockwave traveled through the ground at over 13,000 miles per hour and was felt as far away as 250 miles. Even worse than the ground wave was the air waves. A concussive blast ripped through the air. Buildings nearby were torn apart by the blast. The blast traveled over 2,100 miles per hour. Every window in Halifax was blown out. Windows in Nova Scotia, 50 miles away, were destroyed. And these windows were not just shattered, they were blown in and turned into hundreds of tiny knives. Almost anyone who was not at the harbor watching was at their windows. Hundreds of people would be torn apart and left bleeding, blinded, or dead as the glass was blown in their faces. As the air blast traveled through Halifax, destroying building after building, it picked up more and more debris to smash into the next obstacle in its way. And it smashed everything. People and buildings in its path were struck down. Fires were started and quickly spread by the air sweeping through. Following the air blast was a tsunami. The force of the blast split the Narrows to the point you could see the seabed. It sent 35-foot waves to smash through the buildings just devastated by the previous blast. When the water receded, the undertow dragged anyone unlucky enough to be caught in it back down the harbor to drown. On the other side of the harbor, half of Dartmouth had been crushed. The tiny village of Turtle Grove had been completely wiped out. In less than a second, the explosion had destroyed 2 square miles. Pier 6 was gone, just completely wiped off the map. Piers 7, 8, and 9 were destroyed and jumbled into a big pile of debris. Railroad tracks were curled up like they were nothing. Factories were completely crushed. Wooden homes were turned to kindling. In total, 6,000 buildings were destroyed. 25,000 people, nearly half the population, were left homeless. 1,600 people died in the explosion and the aftermath. 9,000 more were injured, left to wander the destroyed city bloody and confused. During the explosion, the Imo had been launched several hundred feet to be beached on the Dartmouth side of the Narrows. 5 crew members, along with Captain Fromm and harbor pilot William Hayes, were killed instantly. Captain Lemedic and the crew from the Mont-Blanc would fare much better. 4 crew members would be injured, and only one of them severely with a broken arm. He would end up dying from his wounds before help could be found. With the shockwave and tsunami gone, the danger still had not passed. Buildings weakened during the explosion groaned and collapsed in on themselves, trapping anyone unlucky enough inside. Fires stirred up by the winds spread amongst the wreckage of the city. People trapped in these buildings under fallen timbers and stone were now at risk of burning to death. The aftermath of the explosion was hell on earth, with fires raging and the screams and moans of the wounded either trapped in wreckage or wandering the streets. People walked around aimlessly, searching desperately for loved ones or anyone who could help. Some survivors searched the wreckage to help trapped neighbors and friends. The dead were everywhere. Corpses strewn the streets. Arms and legs poked out of the rubble. Corpses hung out windows. Grievous wounds on full display with bodies missing limbs and heads. It was a scene of chaos and devastation. Rumors swirled around the city that it was a German attack. There was a fear going around that this was just the beginning, and since communications had been cut, there was no way to spread the news of what happened. There was also no way to ask for help from the outside world. So, it was a good thing when a growing number of survivors grouped together to start rescue operations. They were disorganized but helping. However, these would be short-lived. The survivors were being told to get to higher ground and away from the city. There was a concern that a storehouse of explosives would blow up and they needed to leave. Devastated, the survivors headed out, having to abandon their homes and belongings and listen to the screams of the wounded still trapped in the rubble. Survivors that owned cars were asked to help. Cars were few and far between in 1917, and they were desperately needed. Those who volunteered their car in time used them to move food and other supplies from the armory to those in need. Others acted as amateur ambulances, taking wounded to hospitals and aid stations throughout the city. If not for them, many more would have died. Eventually, the army would flood the storehouse and dump ammunition into the harbor to prevent a second explosion, which meant everyone could go back home, which was a problem, since many of them did not have a home to go to. Some survivors would end up staying in the local prison. Prisoners had escaped during the explosion, so they had room available, and any shelter is better than no shelter. Others would have to rely on family and the kindness of strangers for help. One train had made it to Halifax and stopped just outside of town, where the tracks were not tore up. With the hospitals overflowing in Halifax, the train was used to move wounded out of town and bring in more doctors and nurses to help. Other trains started running to Halifax to do the same. Nearby towns would also open up their doors to survivors and offer shelter and what help they could. In the hours following the explosion, doctors and nurses and ordinary citizens took back to the streets to help wounded and trapped survivors. Triage was set up so the most severely wounded with the best chance of survival were helped. The sight of seeing their neighbors help strangers became contagious, and more people would join in the rescue efforts. Heroism and selflessness was on full display amidst the rubble of their homes. The only real major problem now was supplies. There was not enough medicine or anesthesia to go around. Food would become a problem soon also, and there was more bad news to come. A winter storm was heading up the east coast of the U.S. towards them. Now, with the phone lines down and work being done to restore them would take time. But fortunately, there was railroad executives in town who acted. They were able to get telegrams out to the surrounding areas, spreading the word of what happened and asking for relief trains with food and supplies, along with more doctors and nurses. Soldiers and sailors waiting to deploy to Europe were put to work guarding the area to stop looters and help protect the wounded. American servicemen from nearby ships volunteered to help with this to give the Canadians some much-needed relief. While news of the explosion and need for supplies spread throughout Canada and the U.S., Boston stepped up. They were well equipped to deal with a disaster. They had been planning and preparing for one for years. They requested more information from Halifax on what was needed, not knowing they were unable to respond. But Boston did not wait for one. Within 13 hours of receiving word of the tragedy, they had a train loaded up with boxes of medicine and other supplies, along with several doctors, nurses, and reporters, and headed towards Halifax. And they would be desperately needed. Medical personnel and volunteers worked around the clock helping the wounded. They ignored their hunger and exhaustion as they worked to treat as many of the wounded as they could possibly get to, with some working for over 14 hours straight, only to be back after getting just a few hours of sleep to do it all over again. And because shit always has to get worse, during the night, the winter storm hit. There was a 20-degree drop in temperature. Winds in excess of 40 miles per hour whipped through the wreckage, bringing in snow and even more cold. Unable to fight off the cold, some of the more seriously injured would not survive the night. Many others would spend the freezing cold night huddled over stoves and fires in their shattered homes as the winds blew through their broken windows. By morning, more than 16 inches of snow covered the ground. A blizzard was in full effect, changing the city from a burning hellscape on Thursday to a frozen ball of ice on Friday. Snow covered everything, from the dead still in the streets to survivors still trapped in the rubble. The newly repaired phone lines were wiped out again, so communications were cut until they could be fixed. People were trapped in their homes, unable to get out, and rescue personnel were unable to get to them. Every car in town broke down and was unusable. Ships were tossed around the harbor under the high winds. With the snow falling at a rate of an inch per hour, it was the worst blizzard to hit Halifax in over a decade. By Saturday morning, after being slowed by the blizzard, the train from Boston had arrived. The reporters who came with would become very important to getting the news spread around the world and getting more countries and businesses to send help to Halifax. Boston, after having gotten word from the doctors on the train, had raised over $100,000, $2 million in today's money, for the relief effort, along with sending more medical personnel and tradesmen to help with rebuilding. 2 supply ships were loaded up and sent to Halifax over the weekend. The doctors from Boston quickly got to work upon arrival. With help from American and Canadian servicemen, they quickly got a building fixed up and turned into another hospital. They were able to help relieve the struggling hospitals and aid stations and give medical personnel a chance to rest and get some sleep. In the days following the explosion, more and more support rolled into Halifax, both Canadian and American. Millions of dollars of cash, supplies, medicine, and building materials poured in. The generosity of the Americans helped to solidify relations between America and Canada. Prior to this, the relationship between the two countries was often tumultuous, with America often eyeing Canada with thoughts of annexation, and the Canadians looking back with suspicion. Within a week of the explosion, an official inquiry was launched. People wanted answers. 4 separate trials were held over the next 2 years. After much back and forth, it was finally decided in a British courtroom that both ships were equally to blame for the collision, and no one would end up being convicted of any criminal charges. In the weeks following the explosion, the rebuilding began. Rubble was cleared away, and efforts to repair buildings and create temporary shelters began. The explosion had caused over $35 million in damages, which is over $720 million today. So, damage was pretty extensive, and with the war going on, there was a serious shortage of material and men. It would take months to rebuild Halifax. The entire devastated area was redesigned with better roads and parks, and houses would no longer be made out of wood. Halifax would soon rise from the ashes, bigger and better than before. And that was the Great Halifax Explosion, one of the largest non-nuclear man-made explosions to occur. Thanks for listening, and if you like the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice. And you can send comments and suggestions to historiesadisaster@gmail.com, and follow the show on Facebook and Instagram. And don't forget to share the episode, because sharing is caring, and if there was more caring in the world, maybe history wouldn't be a disaster. Thanks and goodbye.